I read my favourite read of the year this month. No contest. Well, actually, kind of a contest, because there was a contest in the story. Let's talk about it. First of all, hi, my name is Corinne. This is a booktube channel. I talk about reading, writing, all that jazz. Nobody cares, let's crack on. The Raven Scholar. Oh my god, this was my S tier book of the year. This was so good, and I've got this lovely special edition with the black sprayed edges. Not the most exciting, but actually the jet black is actually kind of a vibe once I was reading it, so not mad at it. This is a high fantasy book, but it also contains a mystery and it has a very fun vibe throughout. It's not very heavy. There are some really dark and sad moments, but I would say the overall tone of the book is pretty fun and pretty light. There's quite a lot of comedy, there's lots of quirky characters that do quirky things, they have entertaining interactions with each other, and the whole book is just a very fun ride. In this fantasy world, we have an empire where the emperor is replaced every 24 years. We also have 8 different factions, all of which are represented kind of Chinese zodiac style by a different animal. We've got the raven, obviously, we've got the fox, the current emperor is the bear, and so on. And we have this interesting contest every 24 years where each of the 8 houses puts forth a candidate, their chosen candidate, and then they kind of battle for the role of the emperor. And then they serve 24-year term. So a large portion of the plot of this book is about this contest to become the next emperor. However, there's a twist. Near the beginning of the novel, there's a murder, and our main character Nima, who is the Raven Scholar, has to solve this murder. And so we get this really fun high fantasy story with a fun contest and also this murder mystery to solve. And there's also this lore that happens at the beginning of the story with characters that aren't Nima and aren't kind of our main cast of characters. That influences the story throughout and is very relevant. And that's all I'll say because I don't want to give any spoilers. That's pretty much the blurb. But I had such a fun time reading this. It gave kind of adult Harry Potter vibes in the sense that it's a fantasy world and there's a mystery. Harry Potter always has a mystery to solve every book, if not several mysteries. And this had a similar kind of vibe. Our main character, Nima, who is a black woman, also has kind of Hermione vibes. She is a scholar, she's very studious, but she's also not a perfect person. She's kind of unpopular for reasons I won't get into, but also kind of just for who she is. She's always correcting people, like she can't really keep it in, which is very Hermione coded. And while she's smart, she's a scholar, she's in her early 30s, she also has some immature moments, and a lot of other characters have similar immature moments as well. There's a romance subplot in here too. It's not like a huge deal. It's quite a big part of the plot, but it would work without the romance too. And it's not smutty, so it doesn't have that romanticy feel. However, like for high fantasy, which I think can be a little bit inaccessible sometimes, things like Lord of the Rings, they're quite difficult and they're quite literary. They're difficult to get into if you're not used to reading high fantasy. This book is so accessible, so if you're coming from more of a romantasy kind of background, I think this would be a really good transition into more high fantasy because there's still a lot of fun, there's a lot of romance, and it's not too heavy, but there's still some more intricate plot elements, more intricate world building than a lot of romantasy. And overall, it's just a few steps up, while still remaining really exciting, really gripping. Now, I could talk about this like way more, but let's move on to some of the other books in the stack. Next, I read The Poet Empress. This also was about an empire and it was very Chinese mythology inspired, Chinese culture inspired, and it was a fantasy. There was lots of fantasy elements. There's a magic system whereby people have to perform litromancy, which is where they write poems and blessings, and that turns into magic basically. This one, however, was not light, not at all. Bit thinner, but God, was it heavy. There was a lot of really gratuitous violence in this. There's violence against children, against women. The violence is really extreme. It's like torture. There's also pretty heavy themes of like famine and death via famine. And yeah, there was like Game of Thrones levels of violence here. And a lot of the violence is committed by kind of our main male character. The story centers around Wei, this female character. She's 16 and she's just a farm girl, a peasant girl who's struggling in the famine. Her family is struggling in the famine. She puts herself forward to become a concubine for the emperor, or the emperor in waiting, who is this really cruel man that's got a reputation for torture and violence. By putting herself forward as a concubine to bear children for this emperor potentially, she thinks she can get money sent home so that her family can survive, maybe her brother can go to school, and they won't literally die in the famine. And she gets there, she meets this prince. It's not your common romantasy where you've got this really dark male character, but he's nice to her. He is horrible to her, he is very violent, and nevertheless, she has to learn to kind of understand him, understand why he's so violent, why he is the way he is, so that she can make change basically in this empire. And I think that's all I can say without spoilers. But it was very good. It was a beautiful story. This was a debut novel, so quite ambitious in its tone and its themes. It had quite a compassionate view of why people can become monsters essentially. And I don't feel like it went too far and that it was justifying the violence at any time. It was always pretty inexcusable, which I think is good because sometimes the violence is sort of excused in a lot of popular romanticises and things like that, and that's not the case here. However, a lot of our female characters, including our main character Wei, also suffers a lot, goes through a lot of trauma, torture, etc. And they don't necessarily turn into monsters, at least not to the same degree as Terran does. So I don't feel quite as forgiving of Terran as maybe the narrative wants me to. It makes sense why he's turned into this kind of sociopathic figure, but I just want to say that not everyone that goes through trauma is going to turn into a violent sociopath. And also, some sociopaths haven't experienced the same level of trauma as this character does. So I just want to point that out and say that people should be held accountable for their crimes, for their malevolence, even when it makes sense and they have a reason for it. But I still thought this was a really good book and a beautiful story that was very ambitious for a debut. Next, let's talk about the audiobook I listened to this month. I listened to The Make Believe by Hannah Murray. Hannah Murray was the actress that played Cassie in Skins and Gilly in Game of Thrones, and she's done a lot of other roles elsewhere as well. The Make Believe is a memoir. It's her story of how she ended up in a wellness, spiritual kind of cult after the wrap up of Game of Thrones, essentially. She did another movie after that that was quite harrowing and traumatizing to film, and that kind of pushed her to seek out spiritual healing, which then sort of snowballed into her ending up in this cult and believing that magic was real. She ends up going through an episode of psychosis because she was undiagnosed bipolar, and she even ended up getting sectioned and staying in a mental hospital for a while. So the book documents that whole process of her descending into kind of madness and then getting out of it at the end. And nowadays, I think she's doing much better. And I thought it was fantastic. It was an amazing memoir. I would definitely recommend it, even if you've not seen Game of Thrones or Skins. It's not really about that, it's about Hannah and her lived experience. I think it's quite a good cautionary tale because it's very easy to fall down the rabbit hole with some of these spiritual wellness things, and it can be fun, and you can think, what's the harm of doing a Reiki healing? What's the harm of, buying some crystals and things like that? And really, there isn't any harm. However, if you're vulnerable to mental illness and psychosis or manic episodes, it can quickly snowball and get quite out of control. And even if you don't suffer from those disorders or those tendencies, because I mean, Hannah wasn't diagnosed before this happened, it sort of triggered the episode that led to her diagnosis. But these beliefs can kind of start out as a bit of fun, and then you can end up quite quickly becoming delusional and losing touch with reality because you do something, it gets reinforced because it feels good. You start to think, maybe I am special. It's very easy to think you've manifested something because you wanted something and then that's happened, and then apply more meaning to that than actually exists. I always feel like if I want a song to come on shuffle, it always does whenever I think about it, or if I'm thinking about certain numbers, I'll see like 1111 everywhere and things like that. I think I fall into going, oh, that was weird, that was a little bit weird, sometimes as well. And I also watch things on TikTok about satanic cults and all of these kind of rabbit hole, unhinged topics. And I think I'm quite good at leaving it as a bit of fun and then going, okay, but don't let it go too far. But I think it going too far can happen quite easy. That's all I'm saying. So I think this memoir was a good warning not to get sucked into these things too far. And this specific cult in the book, they really preyed on that. They could see that she was vulnerable and they just kept pushing her to like buy more courses and saying that she would find the answers if she bought more courses. They're recruiting people at the healings, so presumably they're people that are struggling and feel like they need a healing. And it was just very predatory, so I think that's also something to be mindful of. But anyway, very good memoir. Don't know if she'll ever write anything else or any other memoirs, but I would love to read them if she ever does. Speaking of like diagnoses, I then read The Age of Diagnosis, which I saw in the airport and kind of got triggered by. The subtitle is kind of Are medical labels doing us more harm than good? And all of the subchapters are about like cancer, Huntington disease, autism, ADHD, neurodivergence in general, Lyme disease, chronic fatigue, all things like that, which are all things I'm very interested in. Autism, ADHD, things like that. They're somewhat of a special interest of mine, and I've done a lot of research on them and also on the diagnostic process. I'm also someone that has quite a lot of health anxiety. I feel pain and I'm like, is it cancer? Am I dying? And I feel like I am someone that's quite vulnerable to seeking diagnosis, even when that's maybe not for the best. And I think this book was, even though I expected to disagree with it and hate it, I actually really enjoyed it and found it really eye opening. And it's changed my perspective and helped me calm down quite a lot. The book covers lots of different topics, from how getting genetic based diagnosis can really change your life and how people don't always want to know if they've got something like Huntington disease, for example, because knowing where your life is headed and being paranoid about symptoms can really ruin the good years that you have. The author also talks about like whether diagnosis really benefit everyone. Sometimes there is a benefit, a very clear benefit, and sometimes there isn't. Sometimes people take a diagnostic label and then will actually change their behavior to fit that diagnostic label. This, I believe, is called like the nocebo effect as opposed to the placebo effect. For example, just to keep it away from the controversial autism topic, with Huntington's disease, which is like a brain disorder that is a bit like dementia in your 40s, where you degenerate, you can become angry, you can become forgetful. It's a really terrible disease. One of the patients in this book was convinced that she had it because her parent had had it. They had found out later, and she hadn't gone for genetic testing yet because she decided against it. And her sister, she did get genetic testing and found out that she did have the gene for Huntington disease. Her sister started getting these symptoms of Huntington disease, and this sister who hadn't been tested yet, she also had those symptoms, and they would call each other and they would talk about them and talk about how they were both descending into the grips of this disease. So eventually, this woman did get tested, and it turned out she was negative. She actually didn't have it. All of these symptoms, this irritability, they were actually not the disease. They were a nocebo, because she was so sure that she had it, and she was obviously so scared that she was looking for every little imperfection in her body, in her mind, in her way of thinking, because Huntington affects your thinking and your behavior. She was looking for every little thing and applying it to the disease when no disease was present. Of course, over time, it would have been evident that she didn't have it because she would have stayed at that minor level of being a little bit irritable without declining. But she probably spent several miserable years feeling these symptoms, thinking, yep, that's it, I've got it. And she actually didn't, if she got the test sooner, she probably would have known that, but she was too scared to have the confirmation, which is completely valid. And this book talks a lot about why people don't want to get the clear yes or no, and it's very complicated, and you have to have therapy with genetic counselors before they even do a test to make sure that it's the right thing for you, which is all really interesting and stuff I didn't know. So yeah, if that sound of this topic triggers you as well as it did me, give it a read because it's really important, and you can disagree with it all you want, but I think it's a valuable perspective. I think if you want to seek diagnoses for things like autism and ADHD, maybe read this first. Unless you're dead set on how it will benefit your life, then go for it. That's fine. But I'm grateful for this book, and I'm definitely going to bear it in mind every time I feel a bit anxious about my health going forwards. Then I read My Year of Rest and Relaxation. This is like a book talk darling that I hadn't gotten around to yet. It's a literary fiction. It's about a girl who basically wants to sleep for a year. She takes loads of medication, trazodone, etc., and basically just tries really hard to sleep. And she's a bit of an unreliable narrator. She's a satirical kind of character. She's not very likable, as is the case for a lot of these character driven lit fic, weird girl fiction books. As usual, it's more of a character study than like a plot based book because it's a lit fic, and it explores grief a lot and that feeling of wanting to just go to sleep and then maybe in a year things will be better. That's kind of what it speaks to. And I thought it was really good. I think it's a TikTok darling for a reason. Did I have the most fun reading it? No, it was a little bit repetitive. I think it probably would have worked as like a short story, but also like the monotonousness and the repetitiveness of just taking drugs and try to sleep for a year does kind of match the effects, kind of makes it feel like you're there with her and you're dealing with this very restful year. I don't know. But it was good. I'm sure there's other like video essays that go into more depth on the literary themes and blah blah blah. Not going to do that, so go look them up. And yep, it was good. The final novel that I read was The Compound. This is a kind of dystopian novel, which is basically Lord of the Flies that meets Love Island. This is about a TV show set in a compound in the desert where there's like 10 girls and 10 guys. They're in this compound that has some things, but not everything they need. They don't have a front door or a bathroom door. They don't have a lot of food. They don't have lots of things that they need to get by day to day, or just luxuries and things like that. They arrive at this compound and they're not allowed to talk about their lives outside the compound, their normal lives. They're not allowed to talk about the fact that it's a TV show. Same kind of rules as for Love Island. And the boys and girls, like Love Island, have to couple up and share a bed, and anyone not coupled up gets booted out. There's a screen in the main living room that gives them group tasks to complete every day, and when you complete these group tasks, you get items such as food or wood to build a door or things that they need for the compound. They also have little personal tasks on these other devices that they can complete. They're not allowed to say that they're doing a task or what the task is or really talk about it. They just have to do it, and it might be like go and have a conversation with Sam, or kiss or have sex with this person, or break this other person's beloved item. And if they do these tasks, they get little luxury things from brands and they have to thank the brand, and they might get brand sponsorships when they get out of the compound. Again, very similar to Love Island, but there's a more sinister edge to it because you can never really know whether people are behaving because that's what they want to do or because it's a task. Like, did they kiss me because they like me for real or did they kiss me for a task? Don't know. So it adds a lot of doubt and uncertainty into the dynamics between the characters. And the characters are all kind of generic. We've got like Lily is the main character, we've got Sam, we've got Ryan. It's a little bit like Love Island where there's all these generic hot people with these generic names, and it takes you weeks to learn who they are. Lots of people go out and you forget about them entirely because they're not important, but certain standouts kind of become characters on the show and they make it to the final five, six, etc. So it's a similar kind of vibe here. And I like this. It was a fun read. I did think it would get more sinister than it did, just based on the premise. And I had a lot of questions about the outside world. There was allusions to like this war going on, but no real details. I wanted to learn more details, but never really got them. And the book's obviously critical of like these Love Island style reality television shows about how far people can be pushed in general for rewards. As a behaviourist, I think that's quite interesting. But I feel like I got all of those points early on in the book, and then by the end felt a little bit rushed, and I don't feel like we really hammered home a good final point. But I get it, and I had fun, but it was slightly disappointing, but still pretty good. So I'm not too mad at it, but I probably wouldn't read it again. I don't know that I'd recommend it. I think I would recommend it. If the premise sounds good, you'll probably like it, but it's not an absolute must read. It didn't blow my mind, let's say that. And then finally, I read Heartstopper Volume 6. I feel like I've waited years for this to come out, and I've like long since aged out of the demographic for this series. I first read Solitaire when it came out over 10 years ago now. Got the special edition and the normal version up here, and I love Solitaire. It's like one of my favourite books, even though it's way too young for me now. There's something about it, it's just like a comfort read for me. And the accompanying kind of novellas and Heartstopper are also just a comfort read. They're just feel good, they're so sweet. They cover some serious topics with mental health and stuff, but it's not in an overly deep way. It's very accessible to teens. It's like a very good influence on teens. I don't feel like there's anything in these stories that's like inappropriate. I don't feel like it goes too far. It's always very like there's a little bit of sex in this one and the last one, but it's never inappropriate. It's never beyond what teenagers should know or what teenagers do. And it's always got this message of like, well, you don't have to if you don't want to, which I think is nice and it's very wholesome. It's like the opposite of like Skins as a teenage drama. It's like the wholesome version. And I think for queer teens, it's probably really beneficial for them. And it's just cute. It's just so sweet and adorable, and I love it. Um, was it the most satisfying ending? I think it was a bit of an underwhelming ending. We already have the Nick and Charlie novella, which came out, I think, like a decade ago, also, almost a decade ago. And that was kind of the conclusion to their story anyway. The epilogue of Volume 6 goes a little bit past that, maybe a few weeks past that, but it really doesn't go far beyond high school and Nick starting uni, which is fine. I think this probably should stay as a high school story, and we can just make up what happens to Nick and Charlie next in our own heads. Obviously, we think they stay together forever. That's what I'm going to choose to believe, because this story exists not to be realistic, just to make us feel good and happy and less alone in our like teen problems. And some of these problems, like Nick in this one, deals with like perfectionism and try to be the best boyfriend, the best person, so that he can make life better for the people around him. And that kind of leads to some self abandonment issues and not really knowing who he is. I think that's a problem that can persist beyond that coming of age time. I think we develop these issues when we're teens, young adults, but sometimes they can persist into adulthood and that can kind of be a lifelong struggle. So even though it's a younger demographic and a different demographic to me, I still find relatability, mental health issues, things like that. It can start in teenhood, but it can go on to adulthood as well. And we never stop learning and kind of coming of age until we die, basically. We learn to deal with certain things, and then we get new problems. And life always has some ups and downs. So I still found it a little bit relatable. Anyway, that's all for this video. For more videos about books, reading wrap ups, specific book reviews, and content about my writing projects and stuff as well, give me a subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And go follow me on Instagram as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!